December 11, 1964. Bien Hoa Air Base, South Vietnam. A cargo plane banks left in a tight circle, 3,000 feet above a hamlet under siege. Inside the cabin, a loadmaster chalks crosshairs on the window with a grease pencil. Below, muzzle flashes wink from the tree line. The radio crackles. Spooky. We need you close. Real close. For decades, the rule was carved in stone. Fighters are fast, cargo planes are slow, and close air support means diving in hard and pulling out fast. But tonight, something different is happening. The lumbering transport holds its turn, miniguns spinning up to 6,000 rounds per minute, tracers streaming down like a red saw blade. The enemy breaks contact. The village survives. And somewhere in that steady left bank, a handful of pilots just discovered that the slowest plane in the sky might own the deadliest orbit in the war. What they found that night would turn cargo haulers into the most feared predators over Vietnam. The idea started with a problem nobody wanted to solve. December 1964, and the night belonged to the enemy. Across South Vietnam, isolated hamlets and special forces camps sent up flares when mortars started falling, but help came slow or not at all. Fighter jets screamed overhead during daylight, dropped their ordnance, and disappeared. When darkness fell, the defenders were alone. Captain Ron Terry had seen enough of it. Flying transport missions out of Tan Son Nhut, he watched the pattern repeat. Villages overrun at night, outposts abandoned because air support couldn't stay. The math was brutal and simple. A Phantom could deliver 2,000 pounds of explosives in 30 seconds, then spend 20 minutes flying back to reattack. In that 20-minute gap, the enemy moved, regrouped, or finished the job. But Terry had been watching something else during those long cargo runs. Flare ships, lumbering C-47s that dropped illumination over besieged camps, flew in lazy circles for hours. Patient, persistent, and always in exactly the right place when radio calls came in desperate and urgent. What if, Terry wondered, those circles could do more than just light up the night? The breakthrough came at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where Captain John Simons was running tests that nobody quite believed in. Project Tailchaser sounded like exactly what it was, an experiment in chasing your own tail. Simons mounted 3 Su-11 minigun pods on the left side of a C-131 transport and started flying left-hand orbits over the test range. The geometry was everything. Hold the bank angle constant, maintain altitude, keep the turn rate steady, and the guns stayed locked on the same point below. No diving attacks, no pull-ups, just a continuous deadly circle. Simons drew grease pencil crosshairs on his side window and watched the math work. At 120 knots in a left bank, with the target fixed in those chalk marks, every round went where it was supposed to go. The minigun pods could fire 50 or 100 rounds per second, selectable by the pilot. In a 30-second firing pass, 1,800 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition drew a line of destruction across the target area. But here was the revolutionary part. The line never ended. As long as the pilot held the turn, the fire stayed exactly where it needed to be. The test reports filtered up through channels where budget officers and doctrine writers lived in different worlds. Cargo planes didn't do close air support. That was fighter work, fast and violent, and gone before the enemy could react. The idea of a slow, vulnerable transport orbiting for hours over a battlefield struck most commanders as elaborate suicide. Terry's team had to prove it worked where it mattered most, in the dark, over villages, with lives hanging in the balance. 2 C-47s arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base on December 11th and 15th, 1964, configured with 3 MXU-470 miniguns mounted to fire through the left cargo door and windows. The crews called them Spooky after the radio call sign, though the enemy would know them by different names. Each aircraft carried 24,000 rounds of ammunition, 45 illumination flares rated at 200,000 candle power each, and enough fuel to orbit for hours. The first combat missions launched at sunset, when the day shift handed off to the night hunters. Flying at 3,000 feet above ground level, the AC-47s established their orbits over hamlets and camps, where intelligence suggested attacks were coming. The pilots learned to fly by feel, reading the bank angle, altitude, and airspeed that kept their crosshairs painted on the target area below. Radio operators in the back called corrections, left 10, steady, on target. Loadmasters fed ammunition belts into the guns and kicked flares out the open door when ground commanders called for illumination. The first confirmed save came on a clear January night when Spooky 4-1 answered a desperate call from a district headquarters under mortar attack. The AC-47 arrived overhead as enemy forces massed in the wire, preparing for the final assault. Flares bloomed over the compound, turning night into harsh daylight. The miniguns opened up, tracers streaming down in visible lines that ground observers would later describe as a red waterfall. The attack dissolved. Enemy forces melted back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. Word spread through the Special Forces network and ARVN command posts. Spooky could stay. When fighters made their runs and departed, when artillery fell silent to avoid hitting the aircraft, Spooky orbited and waited. The enemy learned to recognize the engine sound of the twin Pratt and Whitney R-1830s, the drone that meant continuous fire and all-night illumination. Some camps reported that planned attacks were called off when the distinctive engine note appeared overhead. The skeptics watched the numbers pile up and slowly changed their minds. By early 1966, the 4th Air Commando Squadron was operating 16 AC-47s across all 4 core tactical zones in South Vietnam. Thousands of night missions answered calls for help, and the survival rate of defended positions jumped dramatically when Spooky was on station. The concept was spreading beyond the C-47s, with AC-119 flying boxcars entering the program and rumors of much larger aircraft being fitted with bigger guns and better sensors. But even as the gunships proved themselves over village perimeters and firebase wire, their crews knew they were flying into a larger fight. Intelligence reports described massive supply movements flowing south through Laos and Cambodia, convoys that moved only at night under heavy camouflage. The Ho Chi Minh Trail carried the war's momentum in truckloads of weapons and ammunition, and interdicting that flow would require something beyond defending static positions. The pylon turn and minigun combination had solved the problem of close air support after dark. Now the question was whether the same geometry could hunt moving targets across hundreds of miles of jungle highway, where the enemy was learning to shoot back with everything from small arms to surface-to-air missiles. The siege at Khe Sanh proved what the gunship crews already knew. When jets were too fast to see the target, Spooky lived over it. January 1968, and the Marine Combat Base sat surrounded by 2 divisions of North Vietnamese regulars dug into the ridgelines. Artillery pounded the airstrip daily. Mortars walked through the perimeter after dark. Supply flights came in fast and low, engines screaming, crews counting seconds until they could climb out of the flak envelope. But when the sun dropped behind the western mountains, a different sound filled the valley. The steady drone of radial engines meant Spooky was checking in for the night shift. AC-47 gunships from the 4th Air Commando Squadron established orbits at 3,000 feet, just high enough to clear the small arms fire, low enough to put accurate fire exactly where the forward air controllers called for it. The Marines on the ground learned to time their movements by the engine sound overhead. When Spooky was on station, they could repair wire, move ammunition, and evacuate wounded without taking effective fire from the tree lines. The numbers told the story of what made the gunships different from everything else in the air war. A Phantom F-4 carried 8,000 pounds of ordnance, delivered it in one devastating pass, then spent 20 minutes flying back to Da Nang for another load. An A-1 Sky Raider could loiter longer with its piston engine, but still had to make individual attack runs, pulling off target to reposition for the next pass. Spooky carried 24,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition and 45 illumination flares, enough for hours of continuous fire. The left-turning orbit meant the guns never lost sight of the target. There was no re-attack time, no repositioning delay, no gap when the enemy could move or mass for assault. The geometry was everything, and the Marines quickly learned to exploit it. Forward observers walked Spooky's fire in 100-meter adjustments, bringing the tracers closer to their positions than any other aircraft could safely operate. The pylon turn held the fire in one location, while the observer made corrections over the radio. Spooky 2-1, drop 5-0 and fire for effect. The red stream shifted exactly 50 meters closer to the Marine positions, close enough that the observers could feel the heat from the tracers passing overhead. Captain Jim Fleming, flying his 47th mission over Khe Sanh, watched a planned enemy assault dissolve in real time. Intelligence had picked up radio traffic indicating a major attack on the eastern perimeter scheduled for 0200 hours. Fleming established orbit at midnight. Flares ready, guns charged. At exactly 2 in the morning, movement appeared in the wire. Muzzle flashes winked from prepared positions in the tree line. Fleming rolled into his firing orbit and opened up with all 3 miniguns. The effect was immediate and decisive. Enemy fire slackened, then stopped entirely. Thermal imagery from later AC-1 and 30 missions would show how the psychological impact worked. Troops massing for assault broke contact and dispersed when the continuous fire appeared overhead. The sound alone, 6,000 rounds per minute from 3 guns, created a psychological barrier that conventional strike aircraft couldn't match. A fighter dropping bombs made noise for 30 seconds, then disappeared. Spooky made noise all night long, a promise that any movement in the open would draw immediate, sustained fire. The tactical revolution spread beyond the siege lines. Across South Vietnam, isolated special forces camps and district headquarters reported dramatic improvements in their defensive positions once Spooky was available for nightly coverage. Camp commanders learned to coordinate their defensive fires with the orbiting gunships, using the illumination flares to identify targets for ground-based mortars and recoilless rifles, then calling in the miniguns to suppress enemy positions that were too close for indirect fire. At Firebase Charlie, 40 kilometers southwest of Khe Sanh, a 12-man Special Forces team used Spooky's orbit to break up 3 separate ground assaults in one night. Each time enemy forces massed in the wire, the team's radio operator called for illumination. Flares bloomed overhead, turning the battlefield into harsh daylight. Enemy soldiers caught in the open scattered for cover, losing their coordination and momentum. The miniguns followed up, tracers walking through the areas where muzzle flashes had appeared moments before. The numbers validated what the ground commanders were reporting. Casualty rates at defended positions dropped by 60% when Spooky was available for night coverage. Enemy contact reports fell even more dramatically, suggesting that many planned attacks were being called off rather than executed against positions with gunship support. Intelligence analysts noted a shift in enemy tactics. Attacks increasingly came during daylight hours when gunships were not available, or were postponed entirely when weather grounded the AC-47s. But the success at static defensive positions was revealing larger patterns in the enemy's war effort. Prisoners and captured documents described massive logistical operations moving through Laos and Cambodia under cover of darkness. Truck convoys, bicycle columns, and porter trails carried the weapons and ammunition that sustained enemy operations throughout South Vietnam. The same factors that made Spooky effective at defending camps, its ability to loiter and maintain continuous observation, suggested it might be equally effective at interdicting those supply lines. The transition from defense to interdiction would require new technology and new tactics. The 7.62mm miniguns were devastating against personnel and light vehicles, but truck convoys and supply depots would need heavier weapons. The visual observation techniques that worked over illuminated battlefields would be useless over the heavily camouflaged trails where enemy logistics moved. Most critically, the low-altitude orbits that made Spooky effective at close air support would expose the gunships to increasingly sophisticated enemy air defenses along the major supply routes. Captain Ron Terry, now promoted to major and serving as operations officer for the expanding gunship program, was already working on solutions. Test flights at Eglin Air Force Base were evaluating larger aircraft, heavier weapons, and new sensor systems that could penetrate camouflage and darkness. The C-47 had proved the concept over village perimeters. The next phase would test whether the same geometry could hunt trucks and supplies across the length of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the enemy was beginning to shoot back with radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles that could reach any altitude the gunships might choose to fly. The answer to hunting at night arrived at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in the form of a C-130 Hercules that looked like it had been assembled by weapons designers with unlimited budgets and active imaginations. October 1968, and the 16th Special Operations Squadron was standing up with aircraft that transformed the gunship concept from village defense to strategic interdiction. Where the AC-47 had proved the geometry, the AC-130 would perfect the technology. The prototype AC-130A that had begun testing in mid-1967 bore little resemblance to the cargo haulers rolling off Lockheed's production line. The left side of the aircraft bristled with gun ports, four 7.62 mm miniguns, four 20 mm M61 Vulcan cannons, and mounting points for 40 mm Bofors guns that could punch through truck armor and bunker walls. But the real revolution was invisible, housed in equipment bays that had been cargo compartments 12 months earlier. Major Bob Ethel, one of the first AC-130 aircraft commanders, watched his sensor operator work the new equipment during a checkout flight over the Mekong Delta. The low light level television system amplified available starlight by 60,000 times, turning a moonless night into grainy daylight on the operator's scope. Forward. Looking infrared painted heat signatures across the landscape, marking running engines and warm bodies invisible to human eyes. The infrared searchlight, invisible to enemy forces below, illuminated targets for the LLTV camera while maintaining the aircraft's concealment. The sensor suite was only the beginning. Black Crow, designated AN/ASD-5, represented the kind of technological breakthrough that intelligence officers dreamed about and enemy logistics officers experienced as nightmares. The system detected unshielded vehicle ignition noise, the electrical signature that every truck engine broadcast across radio frequencies. Hidden beneath the jungle canopy, camouflaged against visual and infrared detection, a truck convoy still announced its presence to Black Crow's sensitive receivers from ranges exceeding 20 miles. Captain Dave Burns, the sensor operator on Spectre 17, demonstrated the integrated system during a mission over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Black Crow detected ignition signatures moving south along Route 92, a truck convoy running with lights off through heavy canopy. Burns slewed the infrared searchlight toward the bearing, painting the target area with invisible illumination. The LLTV camera picked up heat signatures moving along what appeared to be empty jungle. The fire control computer calculated range, bearing, and target motion, feeding data to the pilot's heads-up display. Major Ethel rolled into the standard left-hand orbit, 2 miles in diameter at 8,000 feet altitude. The geometry that had worked for the AC-47 scaled up perfectly to the larger aircraft and heavier guns. At this altitude, small arms fire was ineffective, and most anti-aircraft guns couldn't track targets in a continuous turn. The pilot flew the aircraft like a gun platform, using throttles and bank angle to keep the sensors locked on target while the weapon systems did their work. The engagement sequence was methodical and devastating. The 20mm Vulcan cannons opened fire first, each gun capable of 6,000 rounds per minute, the tracers walking through the convoy's predicted path. Truck engines that had been running went silent. Secondary explosions bloomed as fuel tanks and ammunition cargo caught fire. The 40mm Bofors guns followed up, their heavier shells designed to penetrate bunkers and destroy hardened targets that survived the initial cannon fire. The results were measurable in ways that village defense missions never could be. Intelligence analysts counted destroyed vehicles in post-strike photography, cross-referenced convoy size estimates from radio intercepts, and calculated tonnage interdicted based on truck loading factors. During Commando Hunt III, the interdiction campaign that ran from November 1969 through April 1970, gunships flew 8% of the total sorties but accounted for 48% of the trucks destroyed or damaged along the trail system. The mathematics of the new capability were striking. AC-130 missions averaged 7.34 trucks destroyed or damaged per sortie during peak effectiveness periods, compared to 4.34 trucks per mission in earlier phases of the campaign. The improvement came directly from the sensor systems that allowed positive target identification and precision engagement in complete darkness. Enemy convoys that had moved safely for years under heavy camouflage found themselves exposed to aircraft that could see heat signatures and hear engine noise from beyond visual range. But the technology was only as effective as the crews who operated it. The AC-130's mission required coordination between pilot, co-pilot, navigator, fire control officer, sensor operators, and gunners that resembled orchestra performance more than traditional aircrew duties. Captain Jim Allison, flying as fire control officer on Spectre 21, described the rhythm that developed during successful engagements. The pilot established and maintained the orbit geometry. The sensor operator identified and tracked targets. The fire control officer calculated firing solutions and selected appropriate weapons. The gunners loaded ammunition and maintained the weapon systems. Each crew member's performance affected everyone else's effectiveness. The learning curve was measured in destroyed targets and saved lives, but also in mistakes that cost aircraft and crews. The first AC-130 combat loss came in March 1970 when Spectre 03 was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the trail, demonstrating that the enemy was adapting to the new threat. Surface-to-air missile sites appeared along major convoy routes, forcing gunships to higher altitudes that reduced sensor effectiveness and required heavier weapons to maintain lethality. The 105mm howitzer installation program began in February 1972 as a direct response to the threat evolution. The massive artillery piece mounted in the AC-130's left rear cargo door could engage targets from altitudes and ranges that kept the aircraft clear of most anti-aircraft threats. The first combat use came on March 1, 1972, when Spectre 22 used the howitzer to destroy a truck park from 12,000 feet altitude, well above the effective range of conventional flak. The transformation from transport aircraft to strategic weapon system was complete, but the cost was becoming apparent. Intelligence reports described increasing concentrations of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns along the major supply routes. SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missiles, previously deployed only around North Vietnamese population centers, were appearing at trail choke points where gunships operated regularly. The enemy had recognized that the slow-flying gunships represented a critical threat to their logistics operations and was taking appropriate countermeasures. Major Ethel, now flying his 80th combat mission, understood the tactical evolution that was developing. The gunship concept had proved itself from village defense to strategic interdiction, but success was drawing increasingly sophisticated opposition. The aircraft that owned the night would have to evolve again, incorporating better sensors, heavier weapons, and electronic countermeasures that could defeat the enemy's improving air defenses. The question was whether the evolution could stay ahead of the threat. The bill came due on a clear March night when Spectre 22 disappeared into a fireball 25 miles northwest of the demilitarized zone. Major Phil Marshall was flying his 63rd combat mission, hunting truck convoys along Route 9 in Laos, when the SA-2 Guideline missile found his aircraft at 8,000 feet. The explosion lit up the mountainside for 30 seconds before fading to scattered fires that burned until dawn. 14 crew members died in an instant, victims of an enemy air defense network that had learned to kill the aircraft that owned the night. The loss marked the beginning of the costliest year in gunship history. 1972 brought systematic enemy efforts to neutralize the AC-130 threat through concentrated anti-aircraft defenses and surface-to-air missiles deployed specifically to counter low-flying, slow-moving targets. Intelligence reports described 37mm and 57mm radar-guided guns positioned along major supply routes, their operators trained to engage aircraft in steady orbits. SA-7 shoulder-fired missiles appeared in the hands of truck convoy security teams, giving enemy forces the ability to engage gunships during low-altitude firing passes. Captain Dave Harrison, flying Spectre 17 over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in April, felt the change in enemy tactics during what should have been a routine interdiction mission. Black Crow had detected truck movements along Route 96, and the sensor operators had positive infrared identification of a 6-vehicle convoy moving south through heavy canopy. Harrison rolled into the standard left-hand orbit at 8,000 feet and opened fire with the 20mm Vulcan cannons. The response was immediate and coordinated. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions along both sides of the road, streams of tracer fire reaching toward the orbiting gunship from multiple directions. The barrage was too dense and too accurate to be random small arms fire. Enemy gunners were tracking the aircraft's orbit, leading their fire to intersect the AC-130's predictable flight path. Harrison climbed to 10,000 feet and continued the engagement, but the truck convoy had dispersed into prepared hiding positions, while the anti-aircraft guns maintained suppressive fire. The pattern repeated across the trail system as enemy air defenses adapted to gunship tactics. Truck parking areas that had been easy targets 12 months earlier were now protected by interlocking fields of anti-aircraft fire. Supply depots moved underground or into areas covered by surface-to-air missile sites. Convoy security teams carried portable radar jammers that interfered with Black Crow detection systems. The enemy had studied the gunship threat and was implementing countermeasures that turned every mission into a calculated risk. June 18th brought the loss that demonstrated how completely the tactical situation had changed. Prometheus, an early AC-130A, modified with upgraded sensors and electronic countermeasures, was engaged in a night interdiction mission over southern Laos when an SA-2 missile launched from a previously unknown site. Captain Robert Owen had been flying a modified orbit pattern, varying altitude and turning radius to avoid predictable flight paths, when the missile's proximity fuse detonated 50 feet from the aircraft's left wing. The explosion shredded the wing structure and ignited fuel tanks that turned the aircraft into a falling torch. Owen managed to transmit a brief mayday call before the AC-130 broke apart, scattering wreckage across 5 square miles of jungle. Search and rescue operations recovered 3 crew members who had survived the initial explosion and managed to eject before the aircraft disintegrated. 11 others died in the wreckage, including sensor operators whose expertise represented years of training and operational experience. The losses forced fundamental changes in gunship operations. Mission altitudes increased to 12,000 feet and higher, pushing the aircraft beyond the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns, but reducing sensor effectiveness and requiring heavier weapons to maintain target destruction capability. The 105mm howitzer, originally installed as a precision weapon for hardened targets, became the primary armament for high-altitude operations where 20mm and 40mm guns lost effectiveness. Electronic warfare systems, previously considered optional equipment, became mandatory modifications. ALQ-87 radar warning receivers provided early detection of surface-to-air missile guidance radars. Chaff and flare dispensers gave crews defensive options when missiles were detected. ALE-20 electronic countermeasures pods jammed enemy radar systems, though their effectiveness was limited against newer Soviet equipment that appeared regularly along the trail system. The tactical evolution changed more than equipment and procedures. It changed the psychology of crews who had grown accustomed to owning the night sky over Southeast Asia. Captain Mike Thompson, flying his 42nd mission on Spectre 25, described the new reality during a December mission briefing at Ubon. Enemy air defenses were no longer random or reactive. They were systematic, coordinated, and designed specifically to counter gunship operations. Every mission required defensive planning that assumed competent opposition with modern weapons. The numbers reflected the new tactical environment. AC-130 sortie rates dropped as aircraft were pulled from the most dangerous areas for modifications and crew retraining. Truck kill statistics, which had peaked during the sensor technology introduction period, declined as higher operating altitudes reduced engagement effectiveness. 4 AC-130s were lost during 1972, representing 20% of the total fleet and nearly 60 crew members killed or missing in action. But the adaptation was working both directions. Gunship crews developed new tactics that exploited their remaining advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy air defenses. Multiple aircraft operations, with one AC-130 providing sensor information while another engaged from a different altitude and bearing, complicated enemy defensive planning. Fighter escort missions with F-4 Phantoms providing top cover and suppression of enemy air defenses allowed gunships to operate in previously denied areas. Most importantly, the 105mm howitzer gave the AC-130s standoff capability that preserved their effectiveness while keeping them beyond the range of most threats. The cost had been high, but the concept had survived. Enemy logistics operations still moved primarily at night, and gunships remained the most effective interdiction weapon available. The enemy's investment in air defenses, substantial as it was, represented resources diverted from offensive operations and infrastructure development. Intelligence analysts calculated that every SA-2 missile site required technicians, radar operators, and security forces that might otherwise be employed in direct combat roles. The war was changing the gunship, but the gunship was also changing the war. The question was whether the evolution could continue fast enough to maintain effectiveness against increasingly sophisticated threats. The crew room at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base felt different in January 1973. Fewer names on the scheduling board, empty chairs at the morning briefing, and a map of Southeast Asia with black tape marking areas where gunships no longer flew. The Paris Peace Accords had ended American combat operations in South Vietnam, but the AC-130s continued their night hunts over Laos and Cambodia, where the enemy's supply lines still fed conflicts that diplomats couldn't resolve with signatures on paper. Major Dave Harrison, now Squadron Operations Officer, briefed the new reality to incoming crews who had trained on equipment that was already obsolete. The 105mm howitzer was standard armament on all aircraft, its massive shells capable of destroying truck convoys from altitudes that kept the AC-130s above most surface-to-air missile engagement envelopes. Sensor systems had evolved beyond the early Black Crow installations, incorporating multiple redundant detection methods that could penetrate sophisticated camouflage and electronic countermeasures. Most importantly, the crews had learned to survive in an environment where the enemy shot back with weapons designed specifically to kill slow-flying aircraft. The tactical evolution was visible in mission planning sessions that resembled graduate seminars in applied physics. Captain Tom Allison, preparing for his 60th combat mission, studied intelligence reports that read like technical manuals for Soviet air defense systems. SA-2 and SA-3 surface-to-air missile sites were plotted with range rings showing engagement envelopes. Radar-guided anti-aircraft gun positions were marked with effective altitude bands. Electronic warfare threat analysis identified jamming frequencies and countermeasures that enemy operators might employ against AC-130 sensor systems. The missions themselves had evolved into complex orchestrations of technology and tactics that bore little resemblance to the simple orbit and fire techniques that had worked over village perimeters in 1965. Spectre 43, flying a night interdiction mission over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in February, operated at 14,000 feet altitude, while sensor operators used infrared and low-light television systems to identify truck movements 25 miles away. The 105mm howitzer engaged targets at ranges exceeding 12 miles, guided by fire control computers that calculated ballistic solutions for moving targets in mountainous terrain. But the technology couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability that came with the gunship mission. AC-130s still had to orbit, still had to maintain continuous observation of target areas, and still flew at speeds that made them attractive targets for enemy missile systems. The difference was that crews now understood the threat environment and planned their missions accordingly. Electronic countermeasures were activated before entering hostile airspace. Chaff and flare dispensers were loaded and tested. Fighter escorts were coordinated to provide suppression of enemy air defenses when intelligence indicated high threat levels. The effectiveness remained impressive despite the tactical constraints. Intelligence analysts calculated that gunships destroyed or damaged more than 10,000 trucks during the expanded interdiction campaigns, representing millions of tons of supplies that never reached enemy forces in South Vietnam and Cambodia. The psychological impact was equally significant, as enemy logistics planners were forced to develop elaborate deception measures, alternative routing, and air defense deployments that consumed resources and manpower throughout the supply network. Captain Jerry Wilson, flying sensor operator duties on Spectre 61, watched the cat-and-mouse game evolve during missions over southern Laos. Enemy truck convoys now moved in smaller groups, used multiple routes, and employed sophisticated camouflage that included thermal blankets to defeat infrared detection. Dummy convoys with heating elements created false targets designed to waste gunship ammunition and reveal aircraft positions to air defense sites. Radio jammers broadcast interference across the frequencies that Black Crow systems used to detect vehicle ignition signatures. The countermeasures worked both ways. AC-130 crews developed techniques that exploited weaknesses in enemy defensive planning. Multiple aircraft missions, coordinated from different altitudes and approach bearings, overwhelmed air defense tracking systems designed to engage single targets. Sensor operators learned to distinguish real convoys from decoys by analyzing movement patterns and heat signatures that enemy deception specialists couldn't perfectly replicate. Electronic warfare officers employed countermeasures against enemy jamming systems, turning the electromagnetic spectrum into a battlefield where technical sophistication determined victory. The final operations came during the chaotic evacuations that marked America's withdrawal from Southeast Asia. April 12, 1975, an AC-130s provided overhead security for Operation Eagle Pull, the helicopter evacuation of American personnel from Phnom Penh as Khmer Rouge forces closed in on the Cambodian capital. Spectre aircraft orbited the city throughout the night, their sensors scanning for rocket teams and mortar positions that might threaten the evacuation helicopters. 18 days later, the gunships flew their last combat missions over Saigon during Operation Frequent Wind. AC-130s established orbits over the city as North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the suburbs, their crews watching through infrared sensors as the final helicopter loads of evacuees lifted off from embassy rooftops and military compounds. The aircraft that had been designed to interdict enemy supply lines found themselves providing cover for American withdrawal, a mission that embodied the complex legacy of technological innovation applied to strategic failure. The circle closed where it had begun, with slow aircraft flying patient orbits over defenders who needed help that faster platforms couldn't provide. But the technology that had emerged from grease pencil crosshairs and C-47 gun ports represented a permanent change in how air power could be applied to ground operations. The pylon turn that had saved villages in 1965 had evolved into sensor-guided precision that could hunt individual trucks across hundreds of miles of jungle. The minigun that had broken up ground assaults in the Mekong Delta had grown into a 105mm howitzer that could destroy bunkers from beyond visual range. The concept outlived the war that created it, spreading to air forces around the world that recognized the unique capabilities that came from combining endurance, sensors, and precision firepower in a single platform. The slow plane flying in a circle had become the foundation for a new category of military aircraft, proof that revolutionary ideas could emerge from the simplest observations about geometry, persistence, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom about how wars should be fought.